What the FERC is going on here? This is Energy Matters with Claire
and Dan.
Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, not what makes you want to wake up in the morning, but something that's really critical to our industry. We're going to talk through some of the goods, the bads, the ugly about the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. Starting with something that happened on November 7th of 2025 when Energy Secretary Chris Wright made a directive to FERC to standardize large load interconnection, which expands FERC's authority over interconnection to the transmission system. And required FERC to make a decision in the next 6 months. Why is this so fascinating, Dan? Tell me more.
Well, I have to admit, I can't really get up the muster to say it's fascinating, but I agree with you that it's really important. And from my perspective, maybe from far away in California, what the FERC does is it sits around with its 5 commissioners to evaluate decisions and issues around adding new generation and also adding transmission to the grid. But from my perspective, which I'll just say up front, is what the FERC has typically done is get engaged in things a day late and a dollar short. And by that, what I mean is that they are, in my view, entirely reactive, not active or transactive. But I do like what you started us off with, Claire, and saying, what did the Secretary of Energy say should happen just a few weeks ago in terms of a new proposed rulemaking? So tell us what it is and why you're excited about it, and I'll try to pretend I'm excited too.
Okay, understood. Okay, so just to be very clear for our listeners, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission has historically regulated the process of getting generation connected to the grid, but load interconnection has been left to the states. So that's a gobbledygook, right, of a spaghetti of things that are going on. So there are grids, they're all over the United States. And why do we have this weird group of organizations together? Mostly because you don't want 3 utility lines going down Main Street, right? So there is some level of monopoly that's going on by having pipes and wires to get your electricity from point A to B. There is by default a monopoly, right? And the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission is the entity that is trying to standardize getting generation connected to the grid. And then the states, via their public service commissions, have some control to work with the utilities to connect points of load. So what you and I use as our energy from our homes, but also the load from data centers to connect to the grid. I mean, the industry, where I'm coming from, would love for the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission to offer expedited interconnection, right? So right now, I, as a solar developer, could have to wait 2-3+ years to figure out whether or not I can connect what I'd like to connect to the grid, which is, it's really not a reasonable way to move the needle, but is in fact where we are.
Yeah, and if you go back to the earliest days of the grid, the Pearl Street grid in New York, the battle with Westinghouse and Edison and Sam Insull, and all these early guys, what Claire just described definitely can happen. We had times when different providers were sending their own wires down the same street. And so this idea that we were going to have a natural monopoly, meaning there's an economic benefit to having a monopoly if we could regulate it. And that if is really why, in my view, the FERC exists, because someone's got to adjudicate and hear both sides in this case. Is what I've never figured out to this day after testifying in front of the FERC and writing letters to the FERC is we have, in most states, a Public Utilities Commission. And that group does the same exact thing at the local level, meaning at the state or in some cases the regional level. We'll get later on to what California just did, which is basically try to regionalize their version of this. But it is always surprising to me that we essentially have multiple organizations that, at least from my very poor bureaucratic look on things, meaning I have a dim view of bureaucracy, seem to do the same job.
Well, they do the same job, but it's connecting all of these regional transmission operators. So let's be clear for our listeners. Utilities that you buy electricity from are under state jurisdiction, There are regional transmission organizations that are grid operators. You have the New England Power Pool or NEPOOL. You have the Mid-Continent Independent System Operator or MISO. You have PJM, which used to stand for Pennsylvania, Jersey, and Maryland, and now includes several more states. Those regional transmission organizations coordinate how the utilities work together. And then FERC has jurisdiction over those utilities and approves rates.
And I just wish they did it not just in a more expedited way, which, as you said, everybody wants, but in a way that was more logical. And later in the show, we'll come back to the ways in which I view their operations as sort of haphazard, not logical, because they seem to be always chasing someone's tail, often their own. But to be a little more charitable, you were excited about the fact that the new Secretary of Energy, Chris Wright, asked for a rulemaking, a procedure around getting large suppliers connected. And so tell me why, from your perspective on the business side, this is actually kind of a good thing or kind of exciting.
Well, is it a good thing or not? We don't really know, right? I mean, I think the thing is we're going to get the popcorn out and the jujubes and watch the show, right? So the idea is like, and Jigger Shaw said that on Open Circuit, and, you know, of course, we all are in violent agreement, right? So like the idea is FERC's authority over interconnection to the transmission system, if we can expedite getting load connected, right, or getting new supply connected, that would be great, right? FERC basically wants to take the power away from the states and their utilities for approving of projects bigger than 20 megawatts connecting to the grid. FERC says it wants to make the most of large load flexibility and ideally free up grid capacity at the same time. What does that gobbledygook mean? It means that they want to figure out how to get any big load, a big data center, a big industrial plant, to be able to turn on and off to improve load flexibility. Because when we think of the 87, 60 hours of the entire year, there's really only a couple hours every year that are incredibly difficult for utilities. When everybody's turning their lights on and their air conditioning and solar's about to turn down and what we're all excited about the industry is how do you do demand regulation? How do you turn off the data centers when they need to be? How do you have the supply, moving up and down? How do you have the battery storage working as efficiently as possible so that those few hours of the year that everybody flips out about is something that can be controlled?
So at this point in time, I mean, that sounds all good, and everyone would like sort of new generators and new big consumers, whether it's a new town or a data center or someone's massive marijuana growing center or something, to be able to connect up well. But as you kind of hinted at in the beginning, the number of projects in the queue, meaning they've been proposed, maybe there's been some early construction or not, but they're not approved to go ahead. That process can sit for years and years, and in some cases, there's like 60, 70 gigawatts of supply or demand waiting to come online, and it seems like all you need to do in the modern age is run a pretty simple model, figure out what you think the rates should be, what the requirements should be, and you can permit it and people can get on with the job of building. But that's not what happens, and I'm still baffled by it in a way that really reminds me of, your most bizarre kind of movie or book about bureaucracy, whether it's Franz Kafka, whether it's the movie Brazil, whatever dystopian world where you're chasing a piece of paper attached to a string that someone's pulling down the hallway. That's my perspective on it, which I know is very negative, but every time I look at a good project or even a bad project, it seems like it's stuck in someone's bureaucratic inbox.
Well, I think that's absolutely right. I mean,
but you're supposed to say, no, Dan, you're being way, way too impolite, and you're being way, way too impatient to get these things online, and they take time. That's what I thought you were going to say.
Well, I mean, they do take time, but technologies change, economics change, interest rates change, and the utilities at some level are a little bit picking their noses, right? So projects are waiting for approval are in what you call the interconnection queue. So in PJM, which is one of the regional transmission organizations, the queue could be as easily 3.5 years, right? So I am putting a bunch of money down on the line. I've done my engineering study. I've done an interconnection study. I've gone through every utility hoop, and it could take 2+ years for a bunch of these utilities even to look at my application. So,
And is it the utility or the FERC commissioners? So just to be clear, there's 5 commissioners, there's a chair, and saying nothing about individuals, every administration basically stacks the court, as they say, with their new people. And so this new administration has stacked it in the sense that all of the commissioners on now were appointed in 2024 or later. And that's totally normal. That's not one of my complaints about this administration, of which I have many. But these people are actually quite experienced. They've generally been various energy law judges or lobbyists or experts at different levels before. And so why is it that you can't literally walk in and you take your petition to the FERC and they call their friends at the Department of Energy and they run a model and they say, yeah, this project makes sense, and we might quibble with you a little bit about the price you want, but this is approved, go ahead, and we'll sort out the exact rate you're going to get, your tariff later?
Well, I mean, when you're talking about third-party ownership or a lot of grid interconnection, it really just has to do with the grid operators, the regional transmission organizations. So it really doesn't have to do with pricing. It's just, am I allowed to connect to the grid or not? And, right now, PJM has 63 gigawatts, right? So the equivalent of how many coal-fired power plants?
Call it 63 coal-fired power plants,
63
or nuclear
power plants,
or
right?
even big solar projects. Yeah.
Right. 63 gigawatts of projects in the queue, and only 2 gigawatts out of that 63 gigawatts has actually been approved. That doesn't have anything to do necessarily with the FERC. That has to do with PJM. But the plot thickens because who is actually managing PJM, right?
Yeah, so this is where this inside baseball that you talked about is so important. So why don't you kind of give this case?
Right. Well, so, I mean, I think everyone is realizing that there's an increase in demand coming with AI and data centers. And now, as of December of 2025, we've also seen the Virginia election and the New Jersey election of 2025, where people actually really care a lot about their utility rates and affordability of utility rates, right? And so at the same time, we all really understand that people have not been spending time and money on transmission and distribution. So there's a really good study we will post on energymatters.world by the Bank of America Institute that goes through how money has been spent most recently. So expansion capital expenditures are only 33% of transmission and distribution costs, and replacing and upgrading the existing transmission grid is 67% of the total costs. So we have an aging U.S. grid. And Catherine Blunt wrote a fantastic book about the PG&E crisis, which also talks about the aging grid. And despite the fact that we have higher investment, power outages have become more frequent, right? So there's a U.S. Department of Energy National Transmission Needs Study, which we will also post on energymatters.world, that talks about the magnitude of the additions required, right? So transmission carrying capacity needs to expand by 64% through 2040, which assumes clean energy generation of huge percentages, 80% by 2040. So to go to the insider baseball, all of these regional transmission organizations, all of the utilities are seeing, oh my gosh, there's a lot more need for my transmission and distribution, and I really have no idea how I'm going to handle it.
And this is what's bizarre to me, because none of this comes as a surprise. Because the system does move so slowly, it doesn't take long for experts in the federal or state government or universities or think tanks to do and publish their analysis. So this should not be difficult. This feels exactly like a case of we have bureaucracy because we have bureaucracy, and there are certain groups that are benefiting by the slowdown. And you can point fingers, again, people who might want to build more transmission. But really, utilities are incredibly conservative and they fight for every possible rate increase. And the more the system gets bogged down between the state level, the Public Utilities Commissions, and the FERC, it seems to a conspiracy theorist like myself that this is actually just putting more power behind groups saying we need higher rates, we need higher returns on our investment because the system is bogged down. And so it's like a vicious cycle.
Well, I'm going to support the utilities here in the sense that...
Okay, let's hear it.
Yeah, so in the sense that every American expects when they switch their light switch on that they're going to get electricity, right? We feel that's a God-given right. We're Americans, and we deserve clean water and clean air and electricity whenever we want it, right?
Well, I don't think we deserve. I don't think we say we want those clean things. But anyway, going on.
Well, okay, but we want when we flick a light switch on for the electricity to work, for our Wi-Fi to work, all of those things.
I'll agree with that part,
right? Yep. And the utilities, it is the utilities' job to make sure that those lights turn on. How do they make money? It is 100% based on their incentive structure that they're doing what they're doing. They make money by building more things whereby they can increase the rates to their ratepayers. Now, we can do a whole separate episode on the generation utilities versus the transmission and distribution utilities. The transmission and distribution utilities, like the Pepcos and BG&Es and ComEds of the world, they make money with their transmission and distribution charge on your utility bill by transmitting or moving your electricity from place to place so you get it where you want it when you want it.
So do you think they would want this proactive planning so those lines were open, energized, and running when new supplies came online?
You would think, but I think
you would think
you would think, but I also think this is very much like the telcos in the 1980s and 1990s. Everybody's scared about losing their job, right? And understandably so. So I want to share a cautionary tale, which I think is super interesting, and I highly suggest you take a listen to Jamie DeMarco's Maryland Energy Talk podcast to learn more. There's a really good example of 2 coal-fired power plants in Maryland, and this is an interesting story. So starting in the early 2000s, coal-fired power plants became uneconomic. Many are 40 years or older. Fracking's created tons of methane gas, which powers gas at a lower cost. Coal capacity decreased from 318 to 175 gigawatts from 2011 to 2024. Wagner and Brandon Shore's coal-fired power plants, which have a combined capacity of 2 gigawatts or 2,000 megawatts, which is what PJM approved of last year, just south of Baltimore, Maryland, were slated to close in 2023 because they're too expensive to run. They're more expensive than their energy's worth. The North American Electric Reliability Corporation, which is a nonprofit that oversees reliability standards from the grid, found that coal has the highest equipment-related outage rate, meaning the percentage of the time the generator isn't actually working because of a mechanical or other issue. So coal's outage rate was more like 12%. Wind's is less than 7%, right? So meanwhile, we have the PJM, which doesn't have a long-term generation and transmission plan. Here's part of the rub, right? And where does Federal Energy Regulatory Commission fit in with this? So PJM didn't have a long-term generation and transmission plan. As we've discussed, the interconnection queue is huge, right? There's 40 gigawatts of solar battery and wind projects requesting PJM interconnection in 2022, and obviously many, many more than that today, right? PJM forced the owner of these 2 coal-fired power plants to remain open until 2029 to meet peak loads as needed, which then required taxpayers and ratepayers to pay $720 million to keep those coal-fired power plants open. So let's stop there for a second. So Dan, does that make any sense to you that you're going to keep these coal-fired power plants open when they're uneconomic, they're old, 50 years old, and there's a lot of options that you could use instead of coal?
Well, there's many things on the East Coast that don't make sense to me, and that's one of them. So when you finish this, I'll do the California counterexample that feels smooth, but yeah, this makes no sense to me.
Okay. So meanwhile, there's $720 million to keep these coal-fired power plants alive. I'm going to put a pin in capacity auctions for now because we could do a whole episode on that. But PJM ran models assuming that these plants didn't exist, which increased the amount that ratepayers are paying while they're trying to solve reliability problems. And in the meantime, an additional transmission line from Pennsylvania's Peach Bottom nuclear power plant to the Baltimore region is now being built, which benefits Baltimore Gas and Electric, and will cost an additional somewhere between $700 million to $1.5 billion without a competitive bidding process, and will be passed along to the ratepayers.
It's just painful.
It's
so
painful.
I'll do super short the counter thinking from the California side. So in 2021, the California Public Utilities Commission, the PUC in California, and the Independent System Operator for California, sort of the management board, CAISO, they came to FERC and they said, everyone's doing their own calculation based on examples like you just said, looking at whether this plant that's not economic gets kept open. Why don't we simplify this? Why don't we actually ask you at the FERC to figure out what you think the environmental and the economic damages are of having plants that are not reliable enough, like the coal plant you mentioned with this amazing 12% downtime. And so the FERC took it up. And they did an analysis, and they came up with what they thought was the simplest strategy, which was they were prodded by California and Massachusetts to do so. And that was to say, we think that pricing pollution, pricing carbon, is going to be the simplest thing. This, of course, was under President Biden.
Right. And what year was this exactly? 2020?
This is 2021 when it started.
Okay.
And so the FERC came back and they said, oh, you're actually right. Pricing out pollution is not only good for people's health, but it's also good for businesses because it tells you when an economic mistake is being made, like the coal plants that you talked about. And so the FERC did a whole process. They wrote their whole document. They had hearing after hearing. And then they decided that they were not going to pursue it because this is where conspiracy theories come in. Some people thought that Mr. Trump was going to be elected. Other people thought that pricing pollution sounded to California, to West Coast, even though it's been discussed for years and has been operating as the principle in Europe, and et cetera, et cetera. And so they dropped it. Now we have a new set of commissioners, all appointed by the present president, and there is zero chance that the carbon pricing, which even the utilities, even conservative utilities like the Southern Company and others said, yeah, this would actually help our planning, it was dropped. And
but
so
that was dropped at the California Independent Service Operator?
No, it was dropped at the FERC. So the FERC dropped its own process. And so they said, well, we've done all the studies, we've had the hearings, but we're not going to proceed. And again, whether you think it's because they were anticipating Trump or because they were anticipating some other feature, but it just stopped dead in its tracks. And now we have 5 new commissioners, not part of that process. Even if it were to get started, which nobody thinks it will under this president, it would take another couple years. And so basically, pardon my French, they pissed away 4 years of time, and the FERC is back to square one at best.
I mean, I don't know. It's fascinating, right? Because you and I have been in this industry for a really long time, and it still seems very much like a black box to me. Going back to PJM, PJM is a nonprofit, but its voting members include the utilities that benefit from the decision PJM makes. For example, building an additional transmission line that BG&E can transfer the cost to its ratepayers on, right?
And that's why when the episode began, I said, we did have this need for some regulation way back in the 1880s when the first utility came online and different generators were building their own lines down the same street, which everybody agreed was inefficient. And if we could manage a natural monopoly without making it a natural price gouger, that was sort of what my vision of what the FERC was supposed to do. So I remain very grumpy and sarcastic about the FERC's operation. Not that I think the people aren't. People are excellent. But I do think that the process is one that is not just broken, but it's broken by design.
Well, broken by design over decades and decades of misuse and poorly being used and all of that. I mean, PJM has its own lobbying team and it's influencing policy, and they neglected to make plans for these coal-fired power plants closing, for example. There were tons of ways that this could have ended differently, right?
But it's funny because I just drove today up along the eastern shore of the Chesapeake, and I looked at fields that were just open 3 months ago that had not only solar up and running today, 3 months later, but also they had batteries. And so it doesn't take a rocket scientist, as they say, to do a little bit of planning and modeling to say, hey, we're going to need this. And guess what? renewables and storage are cheaper, faster, and create more jobs. And maybe I'm just leaving out one little feature, and that is they don't have quite as deep a lobbying machine on their side as the incumbents do.
100%. I mean, there's a lot of analysis done about fossil fuel industry just pays as many Congress people and legislators as possible, and the battery industry and the solar industry has to pony up.
Yeah.
There's no question.
So we hate to have an episode that ends on a downer, but I guess my downer is kind of watch this space. This is not a difficult problem. And boy, we could actually green the grid without even upsetting any economic apple cart if we just made everybody have to kind of play by fairly simple rules.
Stay tuned. Check out energymatters.world. This is Energy Matters with Claire
and Dan.